Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Smells Like Identity Hygiene, the podcast that's all about identity security. I am your host, Rosario Mastrogiacomo, and today we have a very special guest. Lately we've had some really, really good guests on the podcast, but today I'm very, very excited to introduce Marene Allison. For those of you that are in kind of the cybersecurity world, you probably have heard or have heard Marene talk in many different occasions. But Marene Allison is the former CISO at Johnson & Johnson. Prior to Johnson & Johnson, Marene held corporate roles at Medco, Avaya, and AMP. She also served as an FBI special agent and in the U.S. Army. And Marene graduated from West Point in one of the first or the first class to include women. She is currently an advisor and a member of several boards, including Sphere. Marene, thank you so much for being on.
Rosario, thank you so much for having me. I certainly enjoy this on a hot summer day.
It is, as we said right before we started recording, it's a very, very great time to be inside in the air conditioning. Now, so Marene, you've had a fascinating career from being in the FBI, CISO, and everything that we just talked about. What would you say are some of the pivotal moments that really shaped your career?
Probably the very first one was when Margaret Heckler told me that she was giving me her principal nomination to West Point instead of the Air Force Academy where I had applied to. That certainly got me on the line of West Point and leadership and what the organization did there, and got me into electrical engineering, which is one of the precursors to computer science and cybersecurity. So that clearly, was at a very young age. At 17, my life was go this way, and that's the way I went. I think there are other pivotal moments. One is when I got out of government service and I went to A&P Foods and took a leap down that road into the private sector. And when I went over to Avaya Telecommunications, and the head of IT security had just left. It's Steve Freed, and he's been in SANS for years, and I love the guy. He had just gone back over to Lucent, and so they said to me, "Hey, Marene, we need somebody to do the security of the network for the World Cup. And oh, by the way, it's voice over IP, and it's never been used in production." And I was like, "Oh, that'll be fun." And so, yeah, that was definitely. And then the one is when you take the recruiter call, even though you're not, you're like, maybe I'm not interested in moving. And it was to be the head of IT security at Johnson & Johnson. So there's always pivotal moments.
So was Avaya the first time that so throughout your career, was it always in cybersecurity, always in security, or
Oh
was
no,
it
there was no
technology?
cyber, Rosario. We were back in the olden days, right? We're back before, cyber. You needed an internet. We had no internet, right? We had mainframe computers, and it really was at Avaya, the telecommunications company, that created the voice over IP protocols that are really the underlying of the internet. The calls we're on
Mhm.
today, our cell phones, the smartphones, all of that wasn't there. And so there was no way to really truly understand what the threat was going to be. And that was good news for me because the threat didn't know how to attack yet either. So it became a very interesting time.
It's funny. I could never explain to my son the concept of. There was a time where you'd give someone your cell phone number, say, but don't call me unless it's an emergency because it's too expensive, right? That concept of, well, I can't make international calls because it's too expensive, and now it's all foreign. And you've reminded me of my very first job where I think 90% of everyone's password was password, right? And it's just you didn't think about, oh, that's just how I get into my device. You didn't think about security, and most of those devices, like you said, were not connected to the internet, right?
Well, and I think that was the very first job of IT security professionals, or CISO, was to get every unique passwords out for everyone, because everyone used password 123 or whatever
Mhm.
company you work for, 123, because it was easy and you could remember them all.
Yeah, so I guess then where would you, was it Johnson and Johnson where it was clearly this is 100% security, or was it somewhere? Because Avaya, that project, that sounds more like a deployment project, necessarily security. Would you say that at what point would you categorize? Because as we transition from kind of general IT to kind of security being a specialized function within IT, where would you say is when you transition where okay, 100% of your role is now just security, not a mix of security and general technology?
Yeah, no, I've always been a security geek. Started out on the physical realm. So if you think about the Army and what you do in the Army, and then when I was in the FBI, I worked on a nuclear terrorism exercise called Compass Rose. And that was understanding how the interplay of the government, all the different agencies worked in response to a lost nuclear weapon. And so when I went into corporate security, I still started out on what I'd say the physical security side, the guards and guns, but then transitioned into the business side of security around in a grocery store, the shrink. And so
Hmm.
I started looking at security in a different way, and it was the holistic view of security. And then Y2K was coming up, and A&P asked me to run their program. And then it was understanding how things like paychecks got done, what would happen if freezers didn't work in stores and generators, kind of a BCP thing. So
Hmm.
I started and it was at A&P that I said, I'm a security professional. I could have gone into running stores or other things in a grocery industry, but I said, no, I'm a security person. And that's why when the Avaya job came to me, I was open to it. And specifically with a technical company, a technology company, I said, yeah, I got to get in there. So I took the leap over there. I was a VP, almost senior VP at A&P, and I went to be a director because I needed IT on my resume. And
Hmm.
it was there the opportunity, it was just by luck. Hey, Marine, would you like to run the Security Operations Center for voice over IP in Korea and Japan and watch a lot of soccer? Yeah, absolutely. I'll take that job. And then when I went to Medco, it was an IT security job that also had physical security and it also had executive protection and business continuity. So the thing that I was very, very good at was not only doing security, but also the business side of security, looking at efficiencies, how to reduce costs, how to get more folks doing different things in security beyond just the one trick pony of what the title was. I mean, there's a guy that is CEO of Covenant down in Florida, and he does IT recruiting or cybersecurity recruiting. I met him when he was running physical security at one of our dispensing facilities in Ohio, and he didn't know how to even use a computer. And then he became I sent him to computer forensics school. He became one of the best computer forensics guys. And it was because I kept pushing the envelope of what is security. And for us in security, we've got the best jobs because our jobs get redefined every millisecond. We're looking at what the new threat is, what are the new technologies. So it's very easy to move into areas that others don't understand, can't budget for, and don't have the bandwidth for. And when we can do that, and then I can take money from what we're already doing and use it to expand areas, I found it very fascinating.
Now, do you find that your experience in the U.S. Army, your experience in the FBI, you kind of approach the problem of security differently than what you might see from your peers in these different companies that would not have come from like a military background?
I think in cyber, it's always about the threat. And I think my military experience was fundamental into understanding what the threat is. And many times when I speak, I raise my right hand and I say, when I went to West Point and I raised my hand and I said, I will defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I did that all the way through 40 years of
10
security
years.
expertise. And when I retired, I was still doing that at Johnson and Johnson with the vaccine. And I think that gives a unique perspective. Now, I know a lot of folks that have no military experience and they understand the threat. But I think coming from the military, in the government service, it gave me kind of a leg up of understanding that, like fundamentally understanding it.
I think, I guess, especially from going from, we were just talking about there was no security to all of a sudden, if you think about this whole security discipline had to be created in what, the last 20, 30 years. I could imagine how coming from that military background, like you said, the thinking about the threat, is probably an easier transition than someone who kind of followed your career path but didn't have that background because they weren't thinking about the threat. They kind of had to learn to treat the outside world as a threat, especially when security was about the perimeter, was about the firewall, was about the antivirus and protecting the individual device. As we transition from that to kind of thinking about identity as the perimeter, right? And that's what everyone talks about now. Identity is the new perimeter. So along those lines, and when we think about that identity concept, right, the idea that we now have a workforce that isn't inside those swipe to get to through the door, and you can only log into that machine. As an aside, I always have to explain to younger folks what Cyber Monday means, right? It's like, see, there was a time where you didn't have internet at home. So when you went in on Monday, you had access to the internet. Again, kind of a foreign concept now when you're carrying the internet in your pocket all day. But that transition from kind of the perimeter and the firewalls and the network being the security or kind of what you had to protect to the identity now being the perimeter. Can you talk a little bit about how, when you advise companies, because you are still advising companies, how they should think about security today versus even like 6 years ago before COVID?
A few years ago out at RSA, I heard someone speak and say there'll be no perimeter. And I thought, what are they talking about? It'll be a flow through network. Well, maybe it's not flow through completely unfettered, but there is the idea that you're going to have people in your network, and that there is no active one. It's completely hard shelled, and then there's a steel pipe to another hard shell, like we used to be able to do, with mainframes. Those were the good old days. And I think the fact that while I was at Avaya, and I was only at Avaya 3 years, we did an acquisition of Nortel, and then we had to split out Nortel, like pieces of Nortel. And that was the IT auditors and I spent, I felt like years together, it was probably a few months, looking at the identity structure and access to data. And I think because I was just coming into IT security and understanding the Security Operations Center for the voice over IP, at that very same time, I was understanding identity. And if you look at it, Sarbanes-Oxley hasn't been around all that long. So we were also working with our internal auditors on all of the requirements that were needed for identity for Sarbanes-Oxley. And I think that what gave me a perspective around identity, and like, wait a minute, you can't really do true security, because if somebody's in and they can be Rosario, there is no there is no way you can defend against that. What will that look like? And you have to remember, for a lot of times there was no contextual identity or being able to say, hey, you're in New Jersey, so therefore you can't be logging in from, Thailand at the same time. And now there are technologies out there. So I think it really is understanding the identity plane. Most companies, or a good portion of the companies, security doesn't own identity. They may own a policy that says you need to use passwords and you need to authenticate and you need encryption, but they may not own the platforms, and then certainly they don't own the applications. And even if you have, good application security, how often are you pulling apart the identity structures that are there and looking at them? And so, what I tell folks is, that terrible subject of identity that you hated and you always were happy that IT had it or infrastructure, go take it over. Go learn it fundamentally and why it is, even if you're doing all the right things in cyber, why you still can be attacked and why somebody still can take over your network.
Yeah, because the attack could come from a login that looks perfectly legit, right? Maybe it's not from Thailand. Maybe it is from New Jersey. Someone logging in as me because my account's been compromised, and something like that would never raise a red flag. But if you are focused on the individual identity, then you might catch that.
Correct.
You might catch that it's not an authorized login. So as companies are starting to, and I'm assuming that when you have these conversations, they are thinking about the security function, and organizations are bringing identity in. How do you see identity evolving? And we'll get to AI in a second. Of course, you can't really have a podcast these days, as I always like to say, without talking about AI. But independent of AI, or maybe it's not independent of AI. How do you think the concept of identity? We just talked about kind of the shift, right? The perimeter, or the firewall being the perimeter, the network being the perimeter, now identity being the perimeter. How do you see that shifting? Are we in the middle of a shift, and is AI going to play a major part in that shift?
Well, when Zero Trust came out, everybody got it. Yeah, we've got to have Zero Trust. But they started looking at the network edge. Oh yeah, Zero Trust. But the reality is it's Zero Trust who is touching the data. You're touching the data at the application level or data lakes or clouds, and it moves so rapidly. And I think we lifted and shifted a lot of the applications versus looking at it in who had advanced permissions in the applications as well as machine identities. And when you start, without I'm going to have to do a plug for Sphere here, right? Is that without having a technology like Sphere and being able to look at it holistically, it would take multitudes of people looking at lines of code to understand the threat you have inside your environment. And ever since, I guess Qualys was one of the first ones, and we were doing vulnerability management. When have we ever done vulnerability management of identity? And now with a technology like Sphere, you're able to start looking at what is the risk of my identity structures. And once you start looking at that and how that brings up, I didn't get my gray hair for nothing, right? It all came from like, oh, you're kidding me, because it's a lot of work, especially those companies that don't have brand spanking new, applications, and they run on legacy, or they're running technologies like as you start to move into the OT environments.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll talk to someone who's not in technology, and I try to describe to them what I do, what Sphere does, and I always say, okay, you work in a large, let's say they work in a large company. I was like, do you think your IT organization, even your technology or security organization knows every single account in the organization, where that account is, who owns that account, what that account could do? Like, well, yeah, of course. How could they not? Like, they kind of don't, right? Unless they are specifically doing a lot of work or using Sphere. I can plugging Sphere too. It's not easy, right? Because accounts are, I like to say, they're hidden in plain sight, right? Whether it's local accounts or database accounts, and then even if you find all these accounts, there's the issue of, yeah, this is an account that's been around for 20 years. The password hasn't changed. Who knows? The credentials could be hard coded in some DLL somewhere. And if we turn it off, we might go out of business, right? There's always the
Bad things could happen if you turn that off. Well, we can't do that, because if we do that, we might not produce
things
our
might
widget.
stop work. Yeah, yeah. And I think, so if we think about AI and AI agents, and lately it seems like this year everyone's just talking about AI agents. Last year was all about AI and Gen AI. This year it's all about agents, and the idea that if you think about the human identity, you have the human that's tied to it. That human can be unpredictable, right? But that human, has a manager and has oversight. And then you take the machine identity. It's very not necessarily as dynamic as the human identity. It's kind of it's either a script or it's an application that uses that account as a service. What about AI identities? What about the AI agents? Do you believe that we have a different category, that they don't really fall under human identities because it's not a human, but the LLM that's tied to it and the fact that it can hallucinate, and all these things, that it doesn't really fall in the machine identity category? Do you think we have a third category for AI agents?
I would broaden it beyond AI agents. I would say to include things like APIs and bots also, like a Blue Prism. Those all also have identities. And are they even registered in your companies? So there is that whole, we've got human identities, machine identities, because there's a physical machine, and then I think we have this bot worker load in the middle, that that is certainly something we need to look at. And you don't know how things are connected all the time, and especially if you look at things like consultants rush to bring in bots, but did they use secure protocols to be able to register those bots in those identities? And I know when I worked at J&J, we had consultants that were just throwing stuff in, and we had to pull it back and create a secure and IT infrastructure protocol of the identities of bots in our network. And I can just imagine that a lot of that, and that was only because we caught it in a way that said, wait a minute, we have a problem here. But I can imagine there are a lot of companies that didn't have that opportunity, don't even know they're there, and they're doing things with their IT that they're not aware of.
Yeah, so I'm currently working on a project that I can't talk about just yet, but I definitely will announce it on the podcast when I can. But we, what we're doing is we're looking at the idea of AI identities, right? That idea that this is potentially a new category. And the one thing that I think about all the time, as someone that has been in the industry for a while, I do, and unfortunately still exists, that old mainframe with some old code that no one really knows.
We had the mainframe in Rack F. A million objects sounds good these days. I'd put some AI on that. That could help us.
Yeah, I sometimes I think about the days of Windows 3.1 and mainframes, but and those things are still around, right? I've had conversations with customers who tell me, yeah, our entire business runs on this mainframe and no one really knows how it works, right? And I worry that we're in this kind of gold rush of AI and even AI identities where everyone is rushing to, I saw a stat the other day that said that 80% of companies talk about AI And I don't know if it was even technology companies. I think, and then the
No,
example
no,
that,
almost
yeah,
every group I talk to, board of directors, they all say, can you include something about AI? I mean,
yeah,
it's
I
everybody
saw a
went,
commercial for a
this is worse than
toothbrush.
cloud.
Yeah, it was an electric toothbrush, AI driven analysis of you brushing your teeth. It's like, okay, so there's this massive gold rush to throw AI at everything and potentially create agents. And what I worry about is that we're going to be building all of these things and no one really understands how they work. Because even with a mainframe, you could look at a static list of lines of code and eventually learn it, right? And eventually understand it. But with LLM, with Gen AI, can one human truly understand everything that's going on? And just the amount, because there's such a rush to throw AI at everything. Do you worry about that? Do you worry that we're going to be in a world where the human is going to be disconnected and then we're going to have a whole bunch of AI agents running critical operations in an organization? And even if it starts doing something malicious, it's like, oh, we can't turn it off. It might put us out of business if we turn it off, even though it's doing something malicious.
Yeah, well, anytime, here's a nice, most companies, if something is doing something malicious, security can turn it off. That I have lived that many times where, okay, the continuing of the bad thing is going to be worse than not doing anything, right? So have been there. Again, everybody's running its boss. How about, think of a few years ago, Rosario, when everything had to be Wi-Fi connected. Your stove had to be, your coffee pot had to be, your refrigerator had to be. How many people use any of that?
Hmm.
Right? I mean, it sounds good. It probably added an extra $100 to the cost of everything. But the reality is, how many times do you really need that? And that's where we start getting to the, like, let's stop the noise, let's stop the hype, and let's get to what do we really need. Now, the being able to use my cell phone to start my car when it's 10 degrees outside, yeah, that's a good one, right? Now, those are the things. Then, okay, what are people going to use and what is it going to look like? um, you know People get a, I remember when voice over IP came out, people were worried. Oh my God, what are we going to do about 911? You're not going to
Hmm.
know where a 911 call came from. And what will happen is it will shake out over time. Maybe some, small bad things will happen, but those areas that are critical, like if you're talking about a hospital operating platform and area, you're not going to have, they're not going to allow things interconnected that could go wrong in the middle of a heart surgery. Those protocols are in place. And so there is some hype. Yes, maybe some weird things will happen. Maybe my coffee pot will dial to the Ukraine and order coffee from Colombia. I don't know. But again, that then goes into the, as humans understand that, like, it all goes through my router in my
Hmm.
house, right?
Hmm.
So, and AT&T or Verizon or whoever is going to see that traffic, and so other things will be developed, and that's what I love about the United States is our innovative spirit in an ability to take things and not only have counter the threat, but counter the new technology so we don't have a threat.
So it's interesting you mentioned coffee pot because I had that exact scenario. My wife bought a Wi-Fi connected Keurig, and the Keurig could not connect to the Wi-Fi, and she couldn't figure out how to make a cup of coffee. She goes, "This thing won't work unless it can talk to the Wi-Fi." Now it turns out if you hit escape a few times, you still can make a cup of coffee. But still, it's like you jam in Wi-Fi for what? So that you can alert me because I've ordered 10 coffee pods, and when I made 10 cups of coffee, it alert or 5 cups of coffee. Hey, you better order more coffee for that functionality. Which I mean, I could
Hey,
just
that's
look in my
Amazon.
cupboard.
That's
Yeah,
Amazon's job. It tells you how much
yeah.
coffee you use. When I was in the grocery industry, I said that to people. It's just like, they were all like, "Oh my God!" At some point, somebody will know. And I said, "Hey, if it's the holiday season and they know I use 2 5-pound bags of sugar every year, could just deliver it to the house.
Hmm.
Save me the problem." And that's Amazon has stepped in there. They're not fully, they haven't fully filled the space. But I don't need my coffee pot to tell me how much coffee I need. But that's hysterical. I love it. I love it.
So
You probably had locked down your router so she couldn't add it. I know you.
maybe, maybe.
Maybe.
Just a foreign device. I don't know what it is. But I get the frantic texts in the middle of the day. I'm at work, and she's like, "I can't make coffee. The Keurig won't work." Um, so part of what you're doing now, you're advising companies. Obviously, we said you're on the board here at Sphere. When you talk about identity today, and you talk about companies and are advising how to protect identities, how would you say the conversation is different than even just, you know, 10 years ago, right? When you talked about, like, if you were advising someone, obviously 10 years ago you were at Johnson & Johnson, but if the way that you thought about identity and identity hygiene, how has that changed from like 10 years ago versus today?
Well, since I arrived at J&J like a couple months later, the CIO anointed me head of identity and access management. So but the hardest part was all the legacy applications and they were the way they were built. And so a lot of that was cleanup of those apps. Now, interestingly enough, back in the day, and that was the rush to the cloud. We were all rushing to the cloud a decade ago, and there were no cloud protocols for identity in the space. Even Microsoft, if you were a Microsoft shop and you were well into using Microsoft, you couldn't use Microsoft. You had to find another, a Ping or an Okta or there was nothing in the space to get you to the internet. And so we were really looking at a lot of new technologies in that space. And then I think it was around data cleanup. Where is all the data and who's accessing it, data lakes. So you were looking at it from a more strategic point of view than in identity, it's real easy to get into the nits and gnats of how things are constructed all the time. But you had to quickly pop in, and I remember having to tell a business unit that they couldn't go to the cloud for something because there was no technology at that time that would allow them to get there.
Hmm.
In healthcare, we had to be concerned about the protection of the data and the healthcare, so you could not move things without having the right technology in place. And today, I think we have a good suite. What is identity? The identity landscape, we're about $2.7 billion today, and it's expected to expand up to about 5.5 billion. It's a growth industry. Finally, Rosario, we identity geeks, we will rule the world.
It was bound to happen.
It was bound to happen. The IT auditors and the identity folks, the people who put in the protocols for Sarbanes-Oxley, they're doing backflips now.
So that brings up an interesting point because, so I came from financial services, right? And financial services, probably more than other industries, tended to spend more on security, right? Protect the money. But I find that, especially recently, I don't see much difference. I mean, obviously, there's regulatory requirements that makes healthcare different from retail, from finance. But the core concept of identity, protecting identities, even just general security, it seems to be the same now. If you look at a hospital, now they might have less money than a Goldman Sachs, for example. But the way I think security people think about securing the environment is the same across industries. Would you agree with that, or do you still see kind of differences between across different industries?
I think you're going to see it's the same and different. You like that
Mhm.
answer? And what I mean by that is I think if you take like the SAN scope of IT security, we're all looking at it the same. But what we're going to do is be looking at it in different ways for our industry. So in banking, you're looking at it that flow of money, and you're looking at the financial services. In healthcare, we're looking at the protected health information, the proprietary of how we create a drug, and then the cybersecurity needed around a medical device. And so I think, and then if you're in the military or in the government, you're looking at it in a slightly different way, but it's all the same concepts. Now, where it stratifies out is really on, you know, Fortune 5 to Fortune 500 or 1,000 or non-SEC companies. That's where it starts. You know, what do you have in place? What are your protocols? Do you have a named CISO? Do you have anybody who does, really does identity, or is that done by a third party that creates your apps? That that will all make into how secure you are. But then it gets what's been thrown at us. AI is great, but the real world is getting digital. And there's the what I'll call the people who are below the digital poverty line. So I rented a car and I had to go speak up at Norwich. So I was in Burlington, Vermont, of all places. And I rented a car, and major company, we all use it. They have an app. We all complain about it, but they were using pin dot printers. So
Hmm.
pin dot printers to give me a receipt in Burlington, Vermont, told me a lot about they just have a digital edge. They're
Mhm.
not digital all the way through. They'll never, or it'll be a very difficult journey for them to be able to use the power of true AI. They might be
Mhm.
able to use, Excel spreadsheets, they might use data lakes, they might use machine learning, but they're never ever going to get to true AI the way they're constructed. So when I talk to companies today, I tell them it's a business choice, right? You can run on Windows 2008 if you want to. That's fine. You might lose things. But if a company comes in, a third party comes in and says, hey, I'll take all that data, you better be looking at the contracts of how they're going to protect it.
Mhm.
Because that is the CEO's reputation now. And what are you doing with that data? And I had the opportunity to talk to a bunch of real estate folks down here in Florida, and I guess the real estate industry had some hard cracks in it. It didn't make national news like it does with a bank or healthcare, uh, but they lost money. People's deposits for houses or transactions, and that money that impacted them greatly. And I said, yeah, that data is very, very important. And if you want to drive into the digital age, true digital, you're going to have to look at how that's constructed and what it runs on.
I had a similar experience several weeks ago. I was at a doctor's office filling out a form, and they had a line for a fax number, and I'm like, fax number? Why are you asking about email? Ask me, my cell phone number to text me. But what are you going to send me a fax? But those things still carry over, and there's still physical fax machines that doctors' offices and these small offices are using, even though you know email, text,
Well, think about
many different ways.
an e-prescription, right? So,
Hmm.
what's the difference with an e-prescription versus the doctor has to fax over to the pharmacy, and then the whole chain? So when I was at Medco, we used to bring in those prescriptions, the hard
Hmm.
prescriptions, and we used to digitize them to be able to use them. But then we could look to compare signatures from the same doctor. Is it the
Hmm.
same signature? To detect fraud, to detect abuse of other drugs. But without it being digitized, you're just looking at two pieces of paper.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you had to, I mean, everyone talks about how AI can help from a security perspective and just in general, right? Versus how AI could be used to harm or to attack an organization. Let's say, if you had to kind of think about fast forward 10 years from now, and you look at, okay, in the last 10 years, AI purely from a security and identity perspective, not just humanity in general, would you say, do you think looking back you're going to say AI helped a security organization more than it hurt, or had a negative effect with all the ways that people are using AI for breaches and such? What would you think? Do you think that it would be a net positive or a net negative?
Net positive. I'll use the example, and since you're from the finance industry, I used to marvel at the bank CISOs, and they'd have thousands of people that were analysts and hunters.
Mm.
And I'm in healthcare, and I'm like, yeah, that's never going to happen. But what happened was the technology of ML came in, and whether that's AI or was truly machine learning, that came in and allowed me to create my security operations centers without needing those thousands of people to do the hunting. And
Okay.
that's a real life example. Now, if you're the CISO that's got, 1,400 people underneath you, did it hurt you when you went to, you could go to 400, or did it help you? I can't answer those questions, okay? But I can tell you, trying to build a world class security operations center and response, ML was, if it didn't come in, I would have never been able to stay ahead of the curve.
Awesome. So we've reached the part of the podcast, Marine, where we talk. We usually like to spend the 90% of it or more talking serious security stuff. And then we have a fun question at the end. It's how we end all the podcasts. So I have an interesting one for you. So if you could go back in time, you have to pick a specific period, an age range, and you could say one single sentence to yourself, right? As a piece of advice, just one sentence and only one period in time, and you can only do it once. What would you do, and what would you say, and why?
I'd go back to my 17-year-old self, and I would tell her she could have been a cowgirl.
Okay, and why?
I have 4 horses now. I live on a farm in North Florida with 219 acres, and just the ability for me to get out there and to ride horses and how free you are. Um, uh, uh, that's what I would tell my 17-year-old self.
And do you think your 17-year-old self would listen, and would
No,
it change
absolutely
the?
not. No, no. She would have gone. She would have gone to MIT or West Point or RPI, one of the other, technical schools, and she would have gone. She would have gone the same path.
So it would have been exactly the same, no difference at all. Is there anything that you can think of that you could say to your 17-year-old self that would have changed the trajectory of your life?
Now, I'm a believer in, and I mentor a lot of folks. In fact, this morning I was talking to a young woman from RPI, and she wants to get into cybersecurity. And and I told her, I said, don't plan out your whole life and your whole career. And I think the fact that I've been as successful as I've been is because I never planned the next step. Right? I always looked at the opportunities at the time in relationship to where I was with my family and expertise, and said, that's the next step. I didn't, I love these young folks who come out of college and I'm going to do this for 3 years and then I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do this. And I'm like, well, what if the technology changes? You know, 10 years ago, we didn't know we were going to be in an AI hailstorm. 10 years before that, we didn't know that the cloud was going to influence us. 10 years before that, we didn't have voice over IP. If you plan it out too much, you're too rigid. And if you're flexible enough, you can continue to grow and learn and be able to use all the things. So when I got to the end of my career at J&J and I was ready to retire, right as COVID hit, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to retire in 8 months, and then COVID. But then I looked in the mirror and I said, if not me, who else could lead a company's security program of a company making a vaccine? And I looked at my quiver of arrows, and I had the military experience, and I had the FBI experience, and I had multiple heads of security, and I had a team that was just phenomenal with their expertise around the world and contacts with people in the government. And I said, I can do this. But if I had sat back and said I can only do these certain things along the way, I wouldn't have had those quiver of arrows.
Marene, I can think of no better way to end this podcast. Thank you so much. This was amazing. Thanks for being on, and anytime you want to come back, you have an open invitation.
Oh, you got me. You'll see me at the end of the month anyway. So, and I've got your power cord, by the way.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. So thanks again. This was fantastic, and I'll hold you to it. Maybe in a month, 2 months, definitely come back, and we could talk about more in depth about the special project that I teased.
I can't wait to hear all about it. Maybe we will make you the podcast.
Maybe. We'll see.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Smells Like Identity Hygiene. Smells Like Identity Hygiene is a production of Sphere Technology Solutions, and our producer is Matthew Clark. Until next time.